So welcome back, and we are in chapter 51 today of Jeremiah, almost at the end. I know some of you are saying, oh, I love this book, I wish it never ends, and others are saying, I thought it would never end. But we're getting close here. I've called this chapter Babylon's Turn, Part 2, because it continues with what we were talking about last time in Jeremiah 50, the destruction of Babylon. Again, this is an event that was anticipated by the prophet Daniel, and the fall of the city of Babylon is described in Daniel chapter 5 that fell to Darius the Mede. I've divided this up into several sections. Verses 1 through 10 is the day of doom. Verses 11 through 14 is a word to the Medes and the Persians. 15 through 24 are about the sovereignty of God. Verses 25 through 58, a long section describing the coming destruction of Babylon. And then finally in verses 59 through 64, we have a word to somebody named Sariah, and I'll tell you who he is when we get there. So let's take a look a little bit closer here. The day of doom in verses 1 through 10. Notice that word in the beginning of verse 1, Libnah or Libkamai, means literally heart of the rebellious. Notice how it's in parallel with the previous verse reference to Babylon. That's just another name for Babylon. It's bringing out this idea, though, of their rebelliousness, those who rise against God. Verse 2, it talks about foreigners that are coming. The word there is foreigners is zor. It means strange. There's different kinds of foreigners in the Bible, particularly with regard to Israel, but in this case it's with regard to Media Persia. These are a strange people, another people that'll come. And notice how he describes the impending disaster that's coming. Really graphic terms. They're going to be winnowed. They're going to be devastated. They're going to be surrounded, imposed on every side, and calamity is going to break against them. This is a very descriptive chapter of the disaster that's going to be coming upon Babylon. Verses 3 and 4 note the futility of resistance. And verses 5 through 6 affirms again, God has not forgotten his people. They will be in Babylon till about 539 when Cyrus liberates them. In the meantime, though, they have this prophecy of Jeremiah reminding them that God has not forgotten about them. His plan for them will continue. Verses 7 through 9, it's kind of a lament that all the allies, all the people that were aligned with Babylon are not going to be able to help this nation. They're not going to be able to mitigate the disaster that's coming upon them. In fact, Israel, in verse 10, is going to recognize that this is nothing else but then the vindication, and then God's vindication of them, and they will be celebrating God's vindication. Verses 11 through 14 then are kind of a word to the Medes and Persians. This is a combined nation, and God addresses them, and he is addressing them because he's the commander of the forces that are gathering against Babylon. They're going to be brought against them. He's the commander, so he's giving them instructions in verse 12 for the attack. And then he turns around somewhat speaking to Babylon at that point and pronouncing the impending doom. Sorry for the dog in the background if you hear him there. I've got my daughter's dog here. Verses 15 through 24 talk about God's sovereignty. It's important to slow down here for a moment. Be interesting exercise if you want to do some Bible study on your own, to look up the references to God's creation of the universe. It's always provided as a ground or a basis for what God is doing. And in this case, it's the ground or the basis for what God is doing through the Medes and Persians to Babylon. It's as if God is saying at this point, look, I've created everything. I can do with it what I want. It's kind of answering the objection of, what right does God have to do this? Well, his right is that he has created all these things. Note also that, if you are in a church or you know someone who denies a literal creation, you could bring him to verses like this and point out that if you deny that God has created, you really rob him of the basis of his sovereignty and authority over the earth. Verses 15 to 16 identify him as the creator. Verse 17, very stark words here, mankind is stupid. They make idols for themselves. This is kind of the epitome or the pinnacle of stupidity, to not recognize the God of the Bible and instead make some kind of idol to replace him. Psalm 14 verse 1, I believe, says, "Fool says in his heart, there is no God." And that's what we see here. Romans 1, beginning in verse 18, talks about how mankind suppresses the knowledge of God in order to establish for themselves idols. Verses 19 through 24, he takes up basically the Medes and the Persians as a weapon of war. He's going to use them as a tool of retribution against Babylon for what they've done to Judah. Talked before about how God, on the one hand, allowed them to go forward in their own murderous intent, and then turns around and punishes them for the murderous intent of their heart, even though he uses it. Again, verses 25 through 58 is really just a long description of how this once great world-dominating empire is going to become crashing down. And note throughout this section, it is God doing it. This is not just, again, the normal, sort of quote-unquote, normal conflicts among nations that come and go. But no, this is God working in history. And his work in history, Daniel will tell us, is got one purpose. It's to bring people to faith before the coming of the Messianic kingdom. The chapter ends in verses 59 through 64 with a kind of a short description or a short instruction to Sariah. Now, Sariah may have been a brother of Baruch. Earlier chapters in Jeremiah indicate this. He's identified as a quartermaster, which means that his job was to basically ensure that those in captivity, and particularly Zedekiah, the king who was taken blind into captivity, were adequately supplied. That's what a quartermaster does. Sariah is charged in verses 60 to 62 with taking this prophecy of Jeremiah about the destruction of Babylon to Babylon and then reading it out loud to them. How'd you like to have that job? I mean, at this point, Babylon is kind of at the peak of their powers. They've overcome Judah and Jerusalem. They're about to move against Egypt. They're going to bring punishment on all the nations around Jerusalem. And now Sariah is sent with a word that they're going to be conquered. He must have been a laughing stock. Verses 60 to 63 and 64 then bring this chapter to a dramatic end with the enactment of the fate that's going to be awaiting Babylon. So Sariah has been instructed to demonstrate that faith by throwing this scroll into the water. What we learn from this chapter, what we can apply, is the fact that God has really created the world. He's the only God. There are no rivals. There is no one to oppose him. He's alone sovereign. He's alone control over all of history. And that control is not just the big things about the nations, but comes down to the details of our daily lives, even in this case, directing Sariah on what he's to do. should be a great comfort for us. Especially we seem to be living in really tumultuous times right now within the United States and internationally in the United States' relationship with foreign countries. And it's good to be reminded and to remind ourselves that God is sovereign. He has created everything, that these nations come and go according to his sovereign purposes and plans. The nations come and go as part of his plan to bring the Messianic kingdom to the earth. So we should take comfort every day, brothers and sisters, in the fact that God's world is under God's complete control. It's not out of control. We're not threatened. He is unrivaled and has unrivaled control. And we, his people, should take comfort in that. So God bless you. I hope this is comforting for you today as we see what he's doing to Babylon. And in the future, he will do this, I think, again to literal Babylon, and will bring history to its ultimate conclusion. Thank you, brothers and sisters, and we'll be finishing up Jeremiah, or finally, for some of you, next time. God bless you.